Last year, 2022, was the 50th anniversary of when I first fished the Dorset Stour, and that was back in the January. And Phil, my fishing mate back then, and I went to Blandford on Crown Meadows, fished a river full of snow water and never had a bite. Last year I went and celebrated that 50 years by fishing Crown Meadows and catching some dace on the stick float. This year though is the 50th anniversary of actually going to the Dorset Stour and catching something. So in September 1973 I was selected to fish for Wareham in the inter-club match against Dorchester. Now, Dorchester Club back then had a stretch of the Stour above the Haywards Bridge at Shillingstone, and it was always called the Child Okeford stretch because that was the nearest village. And their stretch started about, I suppose, half a mile or so above the bridge on the east bank and went up for another half a mile or 2/3 of a mile or so. And over the years we fished matches up there for quite a few years really, certainly in the 60s and 70s, and then by the early 80s they started to use the river below Haywards Bridge, and they acquired more water in the mid-80s down at Handford Farm and Chisel Farm. But back in 1973 we parked somewhere near the old railway bridge at Haywards Bridge, walked up across the meadows, over a footbridge and then upstream to the bit of river up there. And it was the first proper fishing I did on the Stour, if you like. I was given a lot of advice before the match: do this, do that, fish bread, fish worms. There were perch, there were roach, there were dace, odd chub, gudgeon. That's pretty much it really. Minnows didn't count back in those days and they were prolific. And I drew a swim that was only about 3 foot deep, tackled up with a small balsa float and a bit of bread flake. And when the whistle went, I caught 4 roach in the first 5 casts, all about 4 or 5 ounces, maybe a little bit bigger. And as I brought in the 4th roach, a jackpike went for it and missed. And what I realised a bit later is that there had been a big shoal of roach in front of me, and if I'd caught them for even an hour I would have won the match easily. It was only one with 4 pounds. And that shoal of roach, just below me there was a big reed bed that stretched down about 50 yards. They scarpered very quickly and went all the way down through the reeds and found a hole halfway down the reed bed and just sat there. And there were roach from 2 or 3 ounces all the way up to well over a pound, and quite a lot of them, 200 or 300 roach. And what that meant is for the rest of the match I sat there scratching. I think 3 gudgeon, a little dace and a very small roach that left behind. That pike totally wrecked the swim. And at the end of the match, the guy who's the team captain, who's going to remain nameless, sort of said, "Oh, why didn't I do much better?" and all the rest of it. Well, there wasn't a lot I could do. The roach would not come back. There was no way to bring them back. They decided that's where they were going to be, and that's where they stayed. Very disheartening. Anyway, to celebrate that 50-year anniversary, I've gone back to the Upper Stour. I can no longer fish that stretch that we called Child Okeford. It's no longer a club fishery. I don't know if anyone does fish it. I think 1 or 2 people probably sneak out there. There's been a plantation put in the bit where the swim that I drew. I looked at it about 10 years ago and it's hard to recognise the river after the decades have gone by. And that's a shame. It would be a long walk to get up there. So the sort of bits that are fishable are about a mile walk to get there. And if anyone does know about that fishing and wants to get in touch and offer me the chance to go up there and fish one or two of those existing swims, then I'd love to be able to do that. But until then, what I did was find a stretch that was not too far away, but that I could fish on a club permit. And on a lovely September afternoon, I went out and found a nice swim about 3 to 4 foot deep, nice steady flow, quite a bit of colour in the river, sort of a green tinge. Don't quite know what that's about. And back 50 years ago, the river was very clear. I can remember seeing the roach clearly. And after the match, walking up to the top end, and there was a bit of streamer weed and a bit of gravel, and watching roach and dace in this streamer weed, so it was quite clear. Whereas this time round, although I could see fish that were right on the top, small chub and roach, minnows right in the edge, it's certainly far from clear. To commemorate fishing all those years ago, I decided to use a rod that is, I suppose, corresponds to that age. The rod I had in 1973 was an Edgar Sealey Black Arrow, 11 foot, quite a light rod for fiberglass, fairly easy action, and I had an Abu 505, so with a small balsa float, a size 16 hook, and I mostly caught the fish on bread flake. The widow of a neighbour gave me that neighbour's tackle, and included in that old tackle was an almost mint condition Edgar Sealey Contestant rod in 12 foot. So that's pretty close to the old Black Arrow, quite a nice rod. Unlike the Black Arrow, it's got ferruleless ferrules, so it's glass to glass instead of the old brass ferrules, which I was never that impressed with. And although I've got rid of the Abu 505 long ago, I've got my mate Phil's 506 that he sold on to another mate, and I bought it off him many decades ago. He got that reel back in 1972, so he would have been using that reel in the same match. And I've dug out a little Shakespeare balsa 4 number 1 shot and a size 16 barbless hook, and again a little bit of liquidized bread, and using a pinch of fresh bread as bait. So very, very simple fishing, £3 main line, hoping for a few nice roach that would sort of mirror what happened 50 years ago, but you never know. I started fishing, chucking a little egg of this compressed crumb every sort of 10 minutes, and a little bit of flake, just tripping the bottom. At first I had a little bit too deep, catching on a bit of weed here and there. There's odd bits of weed, but mostly the weeds died back fairly good. And the first fish I got was a tiny little chublet, a really very small fish. It wasn't long though before I got a nice roach, about 3 or 4 ounces. And after that, it was a case of plodding along. I'd forgotten how tangle prone the 506 was. A couple of times the line went, in one case round the back of the winding cup, another time round the back of the spool, so I had to take the top off, undo the winding cup and unravel the line, and when it was behind the spool, take the spool off as well to get it out. Didn't damage the line, but it's a bit of a nuisance. The striking of a rod like this is fairly easy action, but it will whip the float out, and I was a bit over enthusiastic a few times, and I went into the reeds and on one occasion and came close another. The nicest surprise, after fishing for half an hour or so, the float went under and I was getting lots of bites all along. Some seemed to be tiny little fish, little tiny roach or chub or minnows, little dibs and dobs that I couldn't really hit. Others it would plunge under, I'd still miss it, but I'd hit a few. And suddenly I found myself attached to a much better fish. It was obviously a good chub. And one of the benefits of the 50 years that have passed since 1973 is I'm vastly more experienced at catching chub. Back then my best chub was about a pound. No experience of catching 2, 3, 4 pounders. My best is far bigger than that. So I was able to handle it, even though the glass rod is nothing like the carbon rods I'm used to, the really top class rods. Able to handle it fairly easily and without panicking, without leaping up and down and shouts of don't wind, and kept it out of the reeds and got it in fairly quickly. After that, the roach came in dribs and drabs. I did try different areas of the swim, casting across a bit further. I've caught plenty of fish out of this swim before on a light waggler with maggots. But I didn't have any maggots. I did try a worm, but the worms kept squirming off the barbless hook. But eventually I hit another chub. This one was a bit smaller, about 2.5 pounds. And again, quite lively, if anything livelier than the first one. But although he dug around in the weed was fairly rotten. By this time it's died back, and it's usually, if the line's not too weak, you can pull out of the weed without too much trouble. And then the roach started to feed a bit more consistently. I had one little chub along the way, no dace, no gudgeon, which it would have been nice to get a bit of variety. Maybe some of the bites were gudgeon. All in all, it was a very pleasant session to fish. Ended up with, I say, 2 tiny chub, 2 decent chub, and 10 roach, the biggest of which was this one here, which is about 6 ounces, I suppose. I've had roach over a pound in this swim in the past. I'd like to think they're still around. This area doesn't get fished very much at all. That's why I chose it. Nice, quiet, unhammered bit of water where the fish are in good condition. I think there's very few matches on this water, maybe one a year, a bit further upstream. So I hope you've enjoyed this anniversary fish, if you like. The old gear does work. People sort of shy away, oh, some fiberglass rod, it must break your arm, but this rod isn't that heavy. Probably weighs, I think, about 9 ounces maybe. It's fairly well balanced. The reel works fine. It's not my first choice of reel, but for the distance I was casting, it was okay. And it makes a change to fish with a small balsa float instead of a stick float or a waggler. And dotted down is no different to a stick float really. And by putting a shot right underneath the float, it sort of balances it so it casts fairly well. And as I say, I mean, the total bait was probably the equivalent of about 10 slices, 8 or 10 slices liquidized, and a single slice of bread as bait that lasted a couple of, about 2.5 hours, I suppose. So very, very cheap bait requirements, and good fun with it. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.